At San Francisco State, and I will. In fact, it's what I'm planning on speaking about. So being an academic, I have a little bit of a hybrid text for you, a couple poems, some academies, a little bit of memoir, a letter that my father wrote, and a poem I based on an email from my stepdad. Am I a love child or a war baby? In the academic art history book I co-edited with Okinawan mixed-race scholar Laura Kina, titled War Baby / Love Child, Mixed-Race Asian American Art, we asked 19 mixed-race Asian American artists how they related to these two very loaded terms. And we were quite surprised that some of the people we had identified as war babies in turn chose to identify themselves as love children, whereas those we had identified as love children thought of themselves as war babies. Here's the academic definition we came up with. The image of mixed Asians has been particularly associated with U.S. wars in Asia, at least since World War II, although it goes back to the U.S.-Philippines War starting in 1898. These war babies, who were often stateless because of citizenship laws in their home countries that were dependent upon paternity, that meaning they didn't get citizenship just by being born there, and a lack of U.S. governmental responsibility, were seen and represented as children of war, always at war with themselves, and both infantilized and sexualized by their public image as the children of U.S. soldiers and hypersexualized Asian and Pacific Islander women. To many Asians, war babies still symbolize the subjugation of Asian people to U.S. and European power. The presumption of white superiority resulted in stereotypes of tragic mulattoes, tragic mixed breeds, tragic mestizos, and tragic Eurasians. Children born of the relationships formed by war have tended to have low social status in their communities and be stigmatized by the notion of impurity. The term love child has two somewhat related meanings, the first being a signal of illegitimacy, as in, she's a love child. And the second being part of the hippie free love era, as in being a love child. Of course, with the 1967 Supreme Court decision, Loving versus Virginia, that was the real last name of the couple whose court case ended anti-miscegenation laws, which had made interracial marriages between whites and non-whites illegal in so many states. And those laws had thus made the children of such marriages illegal, both culturally and literally through the law. Mixed-race people may now have another reason to call themselves love children, as in the children of the Lovings. And here's my poetic interpretation. Before the war, there was no me before the war. My people's faces were not even a dream before the war. Before the war, we had no ancestors to imagine us into being. Before the war, we didn't exist. The war made us, shaped us like figurines out of the mud of battlefields, out of blood spilled by enemies in enmity, out of bloods mingled in the mud. Before the war, there was no me. The war was always there with us. My mother and my father were forever in the war. They battled over the halves of me like starving soldiers over rations. I am not a territory. My body is a landmine, and I am always exploding. Now for memoir. My father was a born charmer, the first son of my charismatic grandfather, who we addressed by the Greek term papu. He was the son of a Greek immigrant with an 8th grade education and a Scottish English mother. Theirs was considered an interracial marriage back then because Greeks weren't white. So the mostly Swedish families in their neighborhood in Seattle shunned my grandfather and his sister. My papu faced further discrimination when he was put into the segregated Greek-American unit of the Army during World War II. Or maybe he was put with his co-ethnics because of their bilingual abilities, or perhaps both. In any case, he was eventually recruited by the OSS, the CIA's precursor, and worked as a spy. As a child in the 70s, I didn't think it was odd that my grandfather's camera was only the size of a fat cigar. Papu was darkly attractive with all the fair-haired Scandinavians in Seattle. He had a way with women who would instantly gravitate towards him when he entered a room, and he was frequently mistaken for both Kojak and Yul Brynner when I was a child. I remember him stopping to graciously sign autographs for mistaken fans. He was hard to resist, and so many women did not resist him. By the time I was born in 1969, when my father was only 21, my grandparents were already divorced because of Papu's repeated philandering. He was larger than life, and I can only imagine what it would have been like to be his eldest son, a position my father occupied with great discomfort. My father, Tom, had his Greek name from Papu's father, Anastasios, nicknamed Tassos. He used this in his email address, while at the same time he told me he didn't feel very strongly about being Greek. It is another mystery for me. How did my father really identify himself other than mostly in opposition to his father? Papu, like many who are the children of immigrants, held dearly the signs of his material success, one aspect of which was insisting that his family eat red meat at nearly every meal. Perhaps around age 19, my father became a vegetarian and encouraged his two younger brothers to be also. He deliberately decided not to enter the military, despite his father's pride in having served in the OSS. My father even moved away. He left Seattle University and transferred to the University of Hawaii, which answers the question of how my parents met. My mother, an immigrant from Hong Kong, had likewise abandoned a colder climate at Michigan State University for UH. They met at a party. They decided to move in together, like that night, and then quite suddenly were married by the time my mother was 20 and my father was 20 and my mother was 23. And then they moved to Australia, where my father thought he could avoid the draft for the Vietnam War, but also so they could join a commune of people devoted to a Sikh master who my father had learned about while taking a Sanskrit class. Thus, I get the title Love Child. I was conceived in a van in the outback. And just 4 months after I was born, we joined the master's Dara in the Punjab. Such a typical Bay Area story. By the time I was 3, we were living in Santa Cruz, and I was tired of seeing my mother so sad. So I gave her the permission I felt she was looking for, and I told her in these words, "We should divorce him." For someone who had always chafed under the yoke of a domineering father and had decided to become a vegetarian hippie living in India, my father was surprisingly domineering himself. Once, when I refused to walk across gravel at the age of 2, and my mother timidly backed me up and suggested that he shouldn't push me to do something like that, which he had said was to toughen my feet, he snapped, "When I say jump, she should say how high," which I found oddly militaristic for a draft dodger. I have such a hard time imagining my father's point of view because of my resentment for how he treated my mother and me over my life. After we divorced him, my father had weekend visitations, and on one of these he kidnapped me. It took my mother 2 weeks to find me, which is another lengthy story of her determination and wit, because no authorities would help her. Over the years, I've tried to understand why he kidnapped me, but I cannot comprehend his thinking. When I was 22, I challenged him about it, asking how he could say he loved me if he could take me away from my mother for 2 whole weeks. He just laughed and said, 2 weeks? Those were the sanest 2 weeks of your life. My father meditated for over an hour every day for 44 years. He didn't eat meat. He raised me vegetarian, which I am to this day. He smoked pot when I was younger and offered it to me, but in later life he had given it up as well as beer and cigarettes. He did these things very clearly because these abstentions made him better than other people. He was sexist and racist. He acted like it was his paid job to comment on the breasts of any woman between the ages of 13 to 93. He was also racist. Once in the middle of a phone call, he randomly asked me, why do groups of black men always have to be so scary? When I commented that it might be because white men so often have the power to ruin their lives historically and currently, and that furthermore, if I pictured a group of the black men I knew, it would be a fairly nerdy picture of lawyers and professors, he just kept saying, black men were scary. Black men are scary. He was homophobic too, and was the worst behaved person in my family when I came out as bisexual, but that is another story. 2 years ago, as my father was dying of bladder cancer, I was in a position to be his primary caregiver, 24 hours a day for the final month of his life. It was a grueling time, especially so because despite the many people from his religious community who encouraged him to use his remaining time to make things right with me, he refused to do so. Even his best friend since the age of 5 told me that no matter how much my father pissed me off, I needed to stay so he could repay what he owed me. His friend told me I needed to give my father the chance to make things right. I tried several times. As painful as it was to risk, I asked him if there was anything he would do differently, and before I'd even finished the word, he snapped, "Nope." We did not achieve a reconciliation, at least not one expressed verbally. The morning my father passed away, I had asked all the other visiting friends and family to give me just a few minutes alone with them, as had become my morning custom. I took his hand in mine and just sat next to his bed, looking into his gray blue eyes. He hadn't spoken in 2 days, and his breathing caught and rattled. One of his favorite Indian ragas was playing. We just looked at each other, and then he stopped breathing. My uncle came into the room and put his hands on my shoulders and said, "Yes, he's gone." After he passed away, I came across a bundle of letters that he had sent to his parents when he was a young man living in Hawaii, around the same time that he married my mother. In particular, I was struck by the way he characterized himself and his frustration with being a young man, trying to determine his life's purpose, trying to set out the values he would live by. He was so young, barely 19 years old, when he wrote this letter to my grandmother, Dorothy Jean, whom he called Maud. "Dear Maud, the master has written from India that I should wait for initiation until I have finished my studies and gotten settled in life, and have become convinced of the no-meat, fowl, fish, eggs, or alcoholic drinks diet. I have been on it for 2 months. I am always too young to do anything I want to do, even merge back into God, which shouldn't be harder if you're young or if you're black or Jewish. But he knows when our souls are ready, so I must have some bad karma to pay off first. We'll see. Your duty is to be helpful towards your family, to try to love them, to even sacrifice for them if the occasion demands. But you do not need anybody, nor do they need you. This is the basis of all your pains." Here he's lecturing his mother. "There should be no attachment. Think about DJ, my grandmother's childhood nickname, the child of God living in a transitory, illusory world that is not all we have, but Maya, literally illusion, and the real world is beyond. When the time comes to leave this world, you don't take your husband or children with you. It's you and God. Knowing this, how much easier to love people only for what they are, not needing them or feeling they need us. Aloha, Tom." Did my father being a hippie make me a love child despite the fact that every aspect of my life with him felt like a war? My father felt that there should be no attachment, but he seemed to use this as an excuse to keep himself from being vulnerable to those who might love him, rather than to love without attachment to expectation. My mother and I moved to San Francisco, and she eventually met and married a fourth-generation Chinese American who was also a Vietnam vet. When I visited Vietnam for the first time in 1993, I was struck by the dynamic opposition of being the daughter of a white man who had dodged the draft and the stepdaughter of an Asian American man who had become an officer in order to serve his country during the war. Like many others who served, my stepfather became deeply disillusioned about his experiences, which included being told never to remove his uniform and never to leave the compound without an African-American companion. His commanding officer told him otherwise he might get mistaken for the enemy and shot. My stepfather told me his deepest fear was being captured and having his uniform removed and his tongue cut off. No one would ever know I was an American, he told me. One day, I asked him how he had survived the war. His email response was so achingly worded it called to be rearranged into the following poem. How I survived the Vietnam War is what you have been witnessing since you met me at the age of 4. Don't misunderstand. It was more about the why and not the how of the war. Why I was there. The importance of the Vietnam War was not so much a matter of survival for me. It was an opportunity for me to learn more about myself. It was a time of testing, limitations, dedication, commitments. The personal lessons of the Vietnam War are many. I was in literal survival mode 24/7 the entire time I was in Vietnam. There were no weekends. I had been properly trained for the leadership role and missions I had to perform, or I would not have been sent. I survived the Vietnam War because I wanted to learn all the lessons it had for me. The lessons had started way before stepping foot in Vietnam and continue today as I write. How did I survive the Vietnam War? A good question. I survived the Vietnam War for the better. So, am I a love child or a war baby? You know what? I'm a grown-ass woman.